I'm not the star of the show. Patricia Zipprodt is the star of the show, but she couldn't be with us. So sorry to say. But Patricia, briefly, was one of the pioneers in establishing costume design as a theater craft, a theater art, separate from the work of other designers in the theater. When she came to New York in the late 40s, it was the case that often the scene designer designed the costumes, or if it was a modern show, they just sent the actors to the store and let the actors pick out whatever it is they wanted to wear, or the producer's wife went shopping and gave the actors what they were going to wear. So Patricia brought to it what was emerging as a real artistic sensibility to what that designer was doing. When she started, there was no separate Emmy for costume design. I'm going to read a section from the book about how this book came to be. And then Laura, because I felt it was really important that a woman's voice read Patricia's words. So Laura's going to do that. In May of 1999, gosh, that's a long time ago, I was helping the theater and film designer Tony Walton, whose name may ring a bell with some of you. He was married to Julie Andrews. I was helping him with his memoirs. I seem to be the person who helps people with their memoirs. And he sent me to interview Patricia down to Greenwich Village at her penthouse apartment to talk about the production of Pippin that she collaborated with Tony on in whatever it was, 1972. A woman named Whitney Blossom, whom I'm sorry to say has passed on, so didn't see this book come to fruition, one of Patricia's longtime assistants, escorted me when I got off the elevator onto the penthouse floor to the open kitchen where Patricia was sitting in a wheelchair. She was bald. She was obviously was very ill. And we began our conversation. It was a beautiful apartment. It was on the top floor. There was a wall of windows looking out. You could see a garden outside the windows, and that garden becomes part of Patricia's story. After she told me how she came to design the Pippin costumes, the story there is essentially the costumes were all white. And the reason for that was not immediately apparent when she showed them to Tony Walton. He said, "Oh, Patricia, what a brilliant idea, all white. I think it's a wonderful idea. I just did an all white production in London. Just make sure there are lots of different shades of white." What she didn't know was that Patricia had failed to put the color in. She was designing the costumes at her house on Martha's Vineyard. There was a plumbing problem. She had to take care of the plumbing problem. And by the time Monday came for her to fly back to New York, she didn't have any color in them. So that was essentially the story, which she talks about. But what happened was then she leaned forward, and she was a very forbidding kind of woman, even though she was bald and her voice had moved up several octaves. She said to me somewhat accusingly, "Do you know what my memoirs are called?" And I thought, "You've got memoirs? Why didn't I know this? Hadn't I done my homework?" And she said, "It's called If the Song Doesn't Work, Change the Dress," which is a very interesting title. So I didn't know what to say. I just looked kind of nonplussed. She walked me down to her bedroom, and we passed by lots of costume plates, costume designs on the wall. And she pointed to some costume designs on the wall. I'm just recalling this. It's still very fresh in my mind. On the wall, and she said, "Do you know who did those?" And I thought, this is another test, and I don't know how I'm going to pass because they were across the room. So I just made a guess, and I said, Leslie Hurry, Desmond Healy, and just, those names popped into my head, and she didn't say anything. And then Whitney came to escort Patricia back to bed. She was spending most of her time in bed. She was ill with cancer. Then Whitney walked me back to the elevator and she said, "Patricia would like to know if you'd like to help her with her memoirs." And I thought, well, yeah, sure, why not? What I later learned was that she had written a memoir called "If the Song Doesn't Work, Change the Dress." She had a collaborator who's was a theater friend of hers. He was not a writer. And they went through many, many drafts. They did it mostly with her sitting down with a tape recorder and talking to Bill Woodman, who was her collaborator. And then he would take it back and do whatever it was he was going to do. They shopped it around to publishers, to agents, and nobody was interested, even though she was at the height of her fame. And the people that she shopped it to had all kinds of suggestions. Oh, make it a coffee table book with lots of pictures. Oh, make it about this was, I guess, I don't know, the history of the feminist movement, 1999. But she talks a lot about how difficult it was for her as a woman, even though certainly there were women in the theater and important positions in the theater, but she found it hard as a woman to make her way against a lot of male prejudice. So some of them said, oh, make it more about your struggle as a woman. Bill Woodman died very suddenly. She got married at the age of 68, moved to Virginia, first time she got married, and then her cancer came back. She had had 2 bouts of cancer earlier in her life. So the whole idea of the book just was abandoned. I was in London doing a project in June of 1999. I was all ready to go to work with Patricia when I got back to New York. I came back on a Monday. I opened the New York Times on a Sunday, and there was her obituary. She had died. I thought, well, there goes that project. However, Whitney, the one who had asked me if I would do the book, and Patricia's sister, a woman named Connie Zonka, asked me to do it, to keep going with it. And I did. And 25 years later, here's the book. What I had to do, and I hope I did it so seamlessly that you cannot tell where Patricia leaves off and where I begin, was to channel Patricia's voice. Liz Woodman, Bill Woodman's widow, gave me all those tapes. So I had the tapes and I could listen to Patricia's voice, and believe me, it's a very distinctive voice. So my job as, I won't call it a ghostwriter because she was the ghost and I was the writer, was to try to recreate her wonderful, wonderful voice. And I hope you'll hear some of that when Laura reads her section. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura. Get out of your way, Laura.
Thank you, Arnold. Starting out in Chicago. Every so often, someone asks me what a costume designer does. My answer is quite simple. I cover up bodies. And I've been doing this for some 40 years. I am in continual and very intimate relationship with performing artists actors, singers, dancers, anyone who gets up on a stage and needs to be covered up. It's often not easy. Once, a prominent singer wailed during a fitting, "I just cannot sing in yellow." When I was costuming a rather noisy Wagnerian opera at the Met, a member of the chorus approached me in her little medieval outfit and complained that the orchestra was inside her hat. This I deal with. And why do I deal with covering up these occasionally mad people? Why do I try to make them capable of presenting themselves as the beings they think they really are? Because they go places emotionally that I haven't the courage or the talent or the knowledge to go. Places I need to go to make my life richer. I need to make that split-second gravity-defying leap a dancer makes. I need to be in the presence of the beautiful sounds a singer produces. I need to know every conceivable human experience an actor portrays. And I want to be there, a fortunate member of their company. How did I come to know I wanted to be in the company of artists? Well, looking back, I see that growing up in Kenilworth, a suburb of Chicago, I was blessed and maybe a little cursed with many experiences which set me on a path to becoming a costume designer, although I had no awareness of that path then. Before the days when fathers and now working mothers take their children to work to get an idea of what they do, my dad would take me down to Chicago to his advertising company office, which was on the 18th floor of the Tower building on the corner of Madison and Michigan Avenues. Oh, I adored it. I could look out the windows toward downtown along Michigan Avenue, to the Art Institute and uptown to the lake at the Drake Hotel. It was my first vision of the city, where I would look down and see these little teeny cars riding on these little teeny roads. It was my first glimpse of urban living. I love the way the scale of things changed. I love being way up in the sky, looking out the windows. But the most fun was the art department. I would be let loose there for a couple of hours to play and to draw and to watch the artists do cardboard work and lettering and painting, all the things they did to prepare models for the lithographic advertising displays my father was commissioned to do. So at the early age, PZ was going into the office, going into a man's world, going into a creative version of a man's world where people made things. They were great cartoonists. They would do very lively, it was a very lively feeling in that art department. And they would do cartoons of each other's on their birthdays. It was one of my father's favorite places in the office. When he wanted to get a break from it all, he would always wander back into the art department. To this day, I still have the three-legged iron bases to the drawing boards from my father's office in my studio in New York. I use it all my life. I got it when I was about 10. It was in the old office, in his office, and Dad brought it home as my table. So the Zipprodt office goes on. I think my imaginative, artistic inner life began very early. When I was little, not more than 6 years old, because I was still living in Evanston, I would put myself to sleep at night by pressing my eyelids until I saw these wonderful little spots. I'd go into that spot space and stay there till I went to sleep. I remember later in Kenilworth, we had a lamp in the basement, and it had translucent parchment lampshade with mottled tortoiseshell markings. I got absolutely transfixed by the light coming through it on more than one occasion, because it was sort of watery. I would go downstairs and take off into this watery world. In the early 60s, when I was a member of the LSD group, I would focus on a face or stone and a vision would come off of it. And it was exactly the same process when I was a kid, except I wasn't taking acid. I was taking lampshade. It was similar to pushing my eyelids, so I began to wonder where inner vision lives, where it comes from, and how you nourish it. I always loved art during school. By the time I got to high school, I was really humming along with it. I had started taking drawing classes when I was about 12. The Art Institute of Chicago had an Evanston annex where their teachers taught Saturday classes to suburban children. I was doing life drawing when I was 12, 13, 14, which is very early. Saturdays consisted of 9 a.m. to noon at art school, then at 1 o'clock to the braces dentist. Afterwards, I would take my drawings home to my dad, who loved seeing them, and he waited for them every Saturday because, well, I was good at it. He was happy seeing this very young person drawing away with charcoal. He would help me blow the fixative across my drawings. My mother started me out, well, like a good mother, with ballet classes. I was 5 or 6, and because I didn't do my bar work at home, that was discontinued. And then I got piano lessons, and I didn't practice for an hour every day, so that was discontinued. What my mother was missing was I would spend all weekend playing the piano. I'd go down to the basement, practice for an hour, and then come back up and I would go out to play. And then I'd go down and practice again for an hour, and then I'd come back up and I would go out and play. So over the weekend, I might practice 12 hours intermittently. But I couldn't bear to sit down at the damn piano every day at 5 o'clock after school. This is important to me because it's a rhythm that started very young and still holds. When I'm designing a show, I cannot do an hour a day or get up early and design for a couple of hours and do the other things of the day. I have to wait until Friday when the week is over. And from Friday night until Sunday night, I will jump into this hole, pull the lid in after me, and just go into a place several levels down where I can study the script or the ballet and start envisioning what is happening on the stage. it's usually very quiet. A lot of puttering goes on, and between the putterings, back in the basement, playing the piano, or looking at the lampshade, or playing the piano for another half an hour or so. Discovering theater. My mother started taking me to the afternoon children's series down at the Goodman Theater. I was fascinated by it. She also took me to see the Humperdinck Hansel and Gretel, which was done by the Chicago City Opera every Christmas at the big Civic Opera House. The angels coming down the stairs transfixed me as the little angels stepped down each step, which were quite high. Each step lit up. I will never forget it. I would look forward to it every Christmas. And so I started acting as well. We did The Merchant of Venice in 8th grade. We actually started rehearsals in 6th grade slowly, 3 hours a week. I learned to adore Shakespeare. I played Nerissa, and I was miffed because I really wanted to play Portia. At New Trio High School, I did a lot of acting. None of it was good because I was so shy. I really didn't have the makings of an actress. As I was discovering my connection to art and theater, I was inadvertently putting them together with a connection to clothing. My mother had been a model, and she loved beautiful clothes, and she wore them with elegance. She always had fashion magazines around, and magazines showing society doings. On rainy days, when I was bored, I drew paper dolls. I painted them, cut them out, and mounted them on cardboard. There were maybe 5 or 6 inches high. They were mostly girls, although there were some boys. There was a blonde lady and a brunette lady and a red-haired lady, and they stood with one hand on a hip and their little toes going out in the classic model's pose. I had the men in their lives and their servants, and I penciled and crayoned a fabulous wardrobe for them and cut them out with little tabs. All their clothes were color coordinated with parasols that matched the dresses or accented them. Their shoes changed, their parasols changed, and even their hairstyles changed. These ladies also had an environment they lived in. I would cut out wonderful pictures from my mother's magazines and catalogs: yachts, hunts, balls, beaches. Any room they needed, I clipped for them. And they had little clothes for all these little rooms. I would dress my dolls with little tabs and march them around to their adventures. They would go to parties and I would put on their party clothes. They would go to the kitchen and I would put on their kitchen clothes. They would go, this whole life going on, and it was a really great trip, and it lasted for several years. When my mother and father sold our house in Kenilworth and moved to Florida, my mother cleaned out the attic. She found a batch of these paper dolls and sent them to me in New York. Suddenly, my past popped up out of these envelopes. My childhood friends, these paper dolls, these funny little people with their little yellow shoes and their matching yellow parasols. And there I was, sitting many years later, doing exactly the same thing, telling stories with clothes. Except that instead of cutting out things from mother's magazines, I was reading scripts that said, second act, they all go to a ball. I thought a great deal about that. How I've observed people, particularly women, who seem to me are looking at their lives very superficially. They aren't pulling from some inner core. They are pulling from a role and doing what the role said to do instead of what their core told them to do. My whole struggle has been to develop a core, the place where that inner vision lives, and to stay away from that expected role, because they can be so totally conflicting. Thank you.
Well, Laura's gonna handle the question.
Do you want to have one for your answers? One for you and one for me?
Should we do that?
Absolutely.
Sorry. Laura's handling the Q&A and I'll just be available. By the way, of course, you've noticed that the cover is the paper dolls. They were clearly very, very important to Patricia.
Well, we thought we might take a few moments and first talk with our author here and start off, ask him a couple of questions. And I thought I might warm up with a couple of questions that I had for him, and then open it up to our audience with a couple of questions. How's that sound for a process? So, Arnold, as a director of theater, what did you gain by co-writing this book with a renowned Broadway and film costume designer?
I will say that I know very little about the art of costuming. I learned a little bit about it when I was writing the book about Santo Costa, because he does both costumes and sets, but costuming was not something that I had much of an understanding for. So I had to educate myself to some extent about what costume designers really do. And reading Patricia's memoirs and hearing her talk about it, I learned a tremendous amount. And I have to say, it's really a shame that I'm no longer doing theater, because now I know how to work with costume designers, but I probably won't get the chance to do it anymore.
Do you have any specific stories or insights around something that you maybe heard in the stories that Patricia was sharing within her memoirs that maybe gave you that delightful insight?
Patricia is a great anecdotalist. She has wonderful stories. I think, as you may have gathered from hearing her talking about growing up in Chicago, she has amazing stories about Jerome Robbins, about Bob Fosse. She has a particularly acerbic chapter on going to Hollywood to design Mike Nichols' film of The Graduate. She calls the chapter something about I hate Hollywood, why I hate Hollywood. And she makes it really clear of why she hated Hollywood and never went back. She wouldn't go. Everybody kept saying, oh, Miss Zipprodt, you will have a wonderful career. And of course, her costumes for The Graduate had become iconic. She costumed Anne Bancroft with all kinds of jungle and tiger and other wild animal costumes, creating the idea of a cougar, of an older woman who preys on a younger man. She also began to use leather before people were using leather. She really just hit upon things that became iconic, and not everybody knows that she was the source of them. There's so many stories of hers. She tells a wonderful story. Jerome Robbins was a very difficult person to work with, apparently, notoriously difficult. And she was working on her first show with him, and he was being notoriously difficult. But she was also working with an actor or an actress who was playing the lead, and the actress was as difficult as Robbins was. And they were constantly fighting. So she got into, Patricia got into a tussle with the actress about the shade of red that a garment was going to be. I'm not sure if it's up here or not, but anyway. So she was determined, she as a young designer, she was going to have her way, and the actor was just going to have to do it the way that she wanted it done. Bad idea, bad idea. She learned from that you really do have to work with the actor. If they're not comfortable in the color, then they're not going to feel comfortable in the role. But what happened was she had all of her forces lined up, including Robbins, to explain to this woman why they had to go with this particular shade of red. They all went down into the basement to talk about it after the dress rehearsal, and the actress was adamant she was not going to wear that color, and they would have to make the garment completely over, which was going to be an expense. And everybody caved in, including Robbins. She ran after him as he was going out of the theater. He pushed through the door. She banged into him and knocked his hat off, and then he burst out laughing. Not something that a young designer working with Jerome Robbins for the first time would have done. But she was fearless. She really was fearless.
Was there a particular story that that she had that captured the title, that influenced that title, about
Yes,
where she
let me
changed
tell
the
you
garment?
where this title came from. It became kind of a mantra for her. She had a number of mantras, but that was one of them. Again, as a young designer, she was working with an actress who didn't want to wear the color yellow. And as far as Patricia was concerned, this was the right color. So she said, "Oh, you're going to look wonderful in it." The costume designer, and this is not something I was terribly aware of when I was directing, but now I'm very aware, she has to make sure that the color she chooses work with the color that the scene designer chooses. You wouldn't want to have a white background to simplify it and an actor in a white dress, because she would disappear. So she kept saying, "Oh, you're going to look wonderful in yellow. The background is all shades of green. You'll really pop out, blah, 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 blah." So at the end of the dress parade, I don't think people do dress parades anymore. This was a time, this is a time when the actors would get in their costumes, walk out on the stage, and let everybody see whether it worked or not. So she came out in the yellow dress, and she said, and she was the lover of the director, whose name was Carmen Capalbo. And she said, Carmen, the dress. And tears began to just stream down her face. And of course, he said, "We've got to get another dress." So she realized that was the way it was going to have to go. She was doing another show, a musical. It was with Ethel Merman, and it wasn't working. It just wasn't working. They were out of town, and the director said to her, it was supposed to be lighthearted and funny, and the director said to her, "Your clothes are not funny enough." It's easier to change a dress or a few costumes than it is to change a set. Cheaper, easier to do. So the scene designer's work is kind of protected because they don't want to throw out a whole stage full of expensive scenery. They'd much rather change the dress. So she learned as she went along that she had to just, now she, as she says in the book, "Now I don't care what's red. Red is red. If she wanted it to be that shade of red, she could have that shade of red, even if it wasn't right."
Wonderful. You said in the beginning that you've learned so much from listening to the stories of Patricia, and if you could go back, you would go back to directing in different ways because of what you learned. So if there were any directors in the room, or if you could go back in time and advise directors on some of the influences that you have gained from getting to know this costume designer so well, what two best pieces of advice might you have for directors who would be, or any creatives that would be working with costume designers, that you think that you might be able to give them as ways of relating to costume designers that you learned from Patricia?
I do, and I'm somewhat ashamed that we had a wonderful costumer named Sarah Stewart. Some of you may remember Sarah Stewart. And I would simply tell Sarah, well, I want the costumes to look like this. And that is not the way to do it. What I needed to tell Sarah was my ideas about the show, and let Sarah's creativity come into play. Tony Walton told me something important along those same lines. He said he would sometimes pretend not to be as knowledgeable about some aspect of what was going on as he really was, so he could draw out the knowledge of the people he was working with. And he would say, well, I really don't know how that works. Why don't you explain it to me and tell me how that works? And that's something I realize now I should have done. I should not have been so prescriptive with my designers. I should have just let things flow from the overall concept of the show. The perfect example of that is Pippin in Patricia's life. She went to meet Bob Fosse for the first time. And she said, well, Mr. Fosse, what is your view of this show? And he said, well, it should be magical. And she thought, gee, that didn't give me very much to go on. So she said, oh, magical, okay. And it's true that the opening number of Pippin is magic to do. So she went back to her studio and she sat for a couple hours, nothing came up. And she said, I'm not going anywhere with this. So she called him back up and she said, Mr. Fosse, can you be a little more specific? And he said, well, it's like Jesus Christ in tennis shoes. And she said that was all she needed. And these are some costume designs from Pippin. What he meant was he wanted it to be very anachronistic, what now would be known as postmodernism. They were doing it way back then. They didn't have any theory about it. To put the people in costumes, just whatever fit the moment, whether it was true to the historical period or not. So Jesus Christ in tennis shoes became the key for Pippin.
Great stories. How do you feel about opening it up? So we're going to open this up to our audience for a little while here for questions, and we'll see what you've got as well, and we might even have some questions for you, for the people that are here. We have audience here in person, and we also have some audience online, which I will be aware of in case there's any questions from our audience online that are zooming in too. So this is a great time for our audience that are here. Curious about the people that are here. How many here are creatives, that consider themselves creatives, that are creators? Fantastic. And do we happen to have any theater creatives here that do any kind of theater and have done any kind of theater? Okay, and out of those theater creatives, do we have any costume creatives that have done costume designing, costume creative? Okay, so gives us a little idea of who's present. And so any questions from our audience, and you can just raise your hand and just ask, and then I'll repeat the question too, and then we'll direct it. Yes.
I want to know about your feelings when you're working on these books. What is it that you enjoy most about these projects that you've worked on?
So what do you enjoy most about these projects when you are writing these books that you've been writing?
I love getting to know these fascinating people like Santella Quasto or like Patricia Zipprodt, although I only had one in-person encounter with her. What it also gives me is a liberty to call up people that I would never have the courage or the reason to call up and say, hi, I'm working on a book. Hi, Woody Allen, I'm working on a book about Santella Quasto. Can we talk about how you and he work together? It took a little more doing than that. Or with Patricia Zipprodt, I'm trying to think of some of the people I might have talked to. I can't think of anybody who comes to mind immediately, but it just gives me the liberty to kind of stick my nose in places that otherwise I might not be able to stick my nose into.
Joel Gray. Wouldn't Joel Gray be in that category?
Joel Gray, yes, Joel Gray. He was a little, off-putting with Joel Gray. Joel Gray and Patricia were great friends. There's a wonderful picture in the book of when Patricia in her final year was pretty much bedridden with cancer. Joel Gray came to see, he played the MC, of course, in Cabaret. And she had designed the costumes for Cabaret. He came to see her very regularly and he would just crawl into the bed with her. It's an adorable picture in the book, but he was a little hard to interview. I felt a little intimidated by Joel Gray. I don't know why that was. I think the reason the interview didn't go very well, as I thought back, but I'm usually a pretty good interviewer, but I think Joel Gray assumed or treated me like someone who was interviewing him for some media publication, like any other reporter. So he didn't let loose. He was guarded and very elliptical about what he had to say. But later on, he and a collaborator with Patricia named Ann Hoole Ward got together and talked about Patricia, and that became the foreword to the book. So he was much more forthcoming. I don't know who asked me that question, but anyway.
Yes.
So I'm really interested in your writing process about this, because you talked about for this book that you had all these tapes and you immersed yourself in the sound of her voice, and you worked. Your goal as a writer was to work to make it seamless, to make sure that her voice was the voice that we heard in the book. Is that the same process that you use, or similar to processes you use in your other books?
Well,
So just to repeat the question,
yes.
the question is about Arnold's writing process, and was the writing process for this book a similar process for the other books, particularly since the co-author was not present during most of the writing process, but present within recordings.
I think this book was different from any of the others I've done. I think Patricia was an inspiration, and hearing her voice, because I worked not only from the tapes that Bill Woodland had used, but she had given lots of interviews that were on audio available. So I was drawing from a lot of sources so I could capture some of her ways of speaking. I did not hesitate to put words in her mouth. I did do that, and I'm hoping that most people would not be able to tell her from me. What I had going for me was every chapter that I drafted, I would send to her good friends and say, does this sound like Patricia? Is this Patricia? Have I got it right? And for the most part, they would say yes, or sometimes they would say, well, this doesn't sound exactly like her, but I would try to do it. You know, writing is a very mysterious process, so it's really hard to say. Sometimes when it just flows, it flows, and then sometimes it doesn't.
Other questions?
Well, continuing along with the writing process, how many drafts did you end up doing, and when did you know you had it? When did you know you had it?
Okay, that's a wonderful question.
When did you know you had it? When was it
How many
done?
drafts did I go through?
Yeah.
I've kept all my drafts. I was writing a piece for Phyllis, and in 2 days, I went through 5 drafts. I write maybe differently from other people. I write paragraph by paragraph by paragraph. And I will stop and revise before I've gone very far. What I say to writers who are asking me for advice is, you've got to figure out what the story is, what story you're telling. I've seen writers too often, they just don't know what the story is. So I write, and then I realize, okay, now I think I know what the story is, and then I go back and make sure. The other thing, this is just a mechanical thing, and I've said this to young writers that I'm working with, it sounds kind of silly. The paragraph is your friend. You've got to figure out a way, can you hold that for just a second? You've got to figure out a way to hook one paragraph to the next paragraph to the next paragraph. So I'm always looking to know how I'm getting from one paragraph to the next paragraph. And then sometimes I know I just end the thought on that paragraph and I start a completely new thought with the next paragraph. I don't know if that helps or not.
It all helps.
Good, good. I never taught writing, but I have tutored people in writing, and I enjoy it very much. I will say that for me, the best way to learn about writing is to just read damn good writing and to say, why is this good? What is about this that is working? Why is it holding my attention? And then I just try to capture what I think the author is doing.
So you said that you didn't know very much about costume when you were doing theater UNTA. But as one of your first students, let me say that you said something to me about, you said something to us about costuming that has stuck with me, and I tried to teach it to Charles, which you're looking at a production, and you talked about the color, how you do colors and fabrics and repetition of, and the echoing of colors and fabrics that match stuff with the character, that in fact, that's how, looking visually at it, you understand that the production works. You understand, before you know anything about the show, who's probably connected to whom, and in the many different ways, and how that plays out. I thought that was very exciting.
Well, I'm glad to know that I knew that. Dee is remarking on the fact that Dee was one of my very first students. It was before we had a costumer, and so I was having to make costume decisions, either by guiding the students to go pick out things or rent them. And I hadn't realized that I was saying that I'm glad I knew that.
I am too.
Yeah, I won't tell the famous story about you, Dee, but Dee and I have a wonderful costume story, but I won't tell it.
Other questions?
Somebody is not, I just want to say, no one has asked the question that I thought might be asked. I was trying to prepare myself for the question is, why the hell did it take you 25 years to get this book
Some of
published?
us can figure that out.
What?
So I think some of us can figure that out if we try to do anything like that. Go ahead.
Well, the truth is, I could not get an Patricia could not find a publisher who was interested in it. I couldn't find an American publisher who was interested in it, partly because she's gone. She's not there to do the television interviews or the podcasts or whatever. The marketers want somebody who's a presence, who's a celebrity. I was about to give up. I think Martha knows this. I was about to give up and go the dreaded route of self-publishing. I dreaded the thought of that. And somebody said, well, you know, I think Bloomsbury in London is looking for new manuscripts. So I sent my proposal. Believe me, I had proposals written. They were all ready to go. I sent my proposal to Bloomsbury in London, and unlike American publishers who make you wait for a very long time before they even get back to tell you that they're not interested, the editor of Bloomsbury Methuen Theater Books got back with me within a few days, said, yeah, we'd love it. And they have been absolutely great. They really have been wonderful. I want to tell you how wonderful Bloomsbury is as a publisher. You hear all kinds of stories about authors struggling with their publishers. I just had a wonderful experience.
Laura, I have a comment. I want to say how much that I personally appreciate Arnold for doing both his book on Santo Laquasto and his book on Patricia Zipprodt, having worked with both of them. I worked with Patricia on Don Juan at the Justice Theater, and Annie Ward, who was a classmate of mine at UVA, was her assistant at the time, so I worked with her as well. And I worked with Santo on As You Like It and Peer Gynt, both at the Guthrie. So,
Yes.
so when I heard that he was doing these books, I was like, bravo,
Good.
bravo.
Yeah.
I know them, and I really appreciate you doing that.
I'm very persistent, as some of you may know. Stubborn is another word for it. And I just don't give up. There were issues about getting rights to things. Patricia's lawyer, a very formidable woman whose name has fortunately gone out of my head, thought she was an expert on copyright law and authors' rights and all that kind of stuff. She failed to put in anything in Patricia's will about what would happen to Patricia's literary output. She didn't think about Patricia having any literary output. She was very careful to protect her visual output, but she didn't have it. So I had a lot of trouble getting clarified about who actually had the rights to her words. I had her words, but it wasn't clear who had the rights to them. So that took some doing.
Aren't her words archived though in somewhere in New York? Her papers,
her papers are all at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center. She was very wise. She kept everything. Some designers are rather careless with their stuff, and they'll give on opening night. They'll give designs to the members of the cast and to the directors. So that stuff just begins to float around. She was very careful. She knew the worth of what she had, her archive, and she kept it all, and it's all at the New York Public Library. And nobody here probably is worrying about PhD candidates, but her career was so varied. There are dissertations and dissertations and dissertations to be written, or articles to be written about Patricia designing for the ballet, Patricia designing for opera, whatever else she did. She was very expansive in her career.
One last thing for me. My first introduction to Patricia was Pippin on Broadway.
What do you mean it was your first
I
introduction?
saw that production.
Oh, you saw
I
that
saw that
production.
production.
We're really old.
We're really old.
Right.
Yeah, I saw that production.
Right. She developed some interesting techniques, and I know we're probably running out of time here. It's often mistakenly said that one of her innovations was painting on fabric. That is not accurate at all. What she realized, she wanted to be a painter, And she realized when she went to see an early production of the New York City Ballet, and a beautiful ballet costume came out that was made with layers and layers and layers of different colored translucent fabrics, that she could paint with fabric. So she always thought of the work on stage as a picture, and she applied her artist's techniques, her artist's eye to the fabric. She did very little painting on fabrics.
There was one person, did you have a question?
One more question.
One last
Oh,
one.
but this is just more about her process and what she really liked. It is such a collaborative, theater is such a collaborative effort. Did she have a favorite collaborator or director or choreographer, or was there a medium that she liked the best? Like, was dance like where she really sang?
I don't know
Was
about dance and
opera?
opera because she does not talk about it in the memoir that she left. The directors she talks about are Jerome Robbins, Hal Prince, Fosse, Mike Nichols. She talks about them in depth. She mentions others as she goes along. The one that she never really clicked with was Mike Nichols. Although even after she said she really didn't want to work with him again, when they got back from working on The Graduate in Hollywood, he had her work on several other shows. He was very demanding and he was very arbitrary. Example, in Plaza Suite, George C. Scott crosses his legs and the sole of his shoe is visible. He insisted that she get handmade shoes from Lobs in London. I don't even know what Lobs is, but apparently he insisted that Anne Bancroft in The Graduate have real diamonds. Who's going to tell on the screen whether the diamond is real? When they fitted Dustin Hoffman for the first scene, he held up the entire filming with all the crew standing around, expensive, because he felt the collar. Dustin Hoffman doesn't have much of a neck, okay? He's got a very thick neck and very low shoulders. So he felt the collar needed to be raised up, and he didn't like the way the seam on the sleeve was puckering. So they had to stop and send it back to be fixed. Everybody, on the clock while this was going. He just didn't care. He was the hot director, so he didn't care.
Thank you. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Arnold, so much
Well,
for your
thank you all
stories and your
for being Patricia for a few minutes.
Oh, well, it was my pleasure, my honor, and thank you so much for this book and for bringing this book forward to us all. And so for all of you who would like a copy of this book, the cash register is open for purchases.
I will sign my pages in the book, but I feel a little uncomfortable doing it. It's not my book, it's Patricia's book. But for those of you who know me or have been here, if you want me to sign it, I'll be happy to do so.
So once you get your book, you can come back for Arnold.